Greetings to everyone, and welcome to another week of Teacher Talks. My name is Christopher Hansen. If I haven't had the pleasure of making your acquaintance before, I have the privilege of serving my community as the Director of Music Education and Orchestral Activities at Seattle Pacific University. Teacher Talks is a student organization at SPU that is sponsored by, Teacher Talks is sponsored by a student organization at SPU called the Falcon Feathers, which stands for Future Educators in the Arts Transforming Human Experience and Realities. It's quite the acronym. And this is a group of students that have dedicated their future career aspirations to serving their community through the arts and education. It's amazing to work with these students, especially in the time that we're living through with so much that's going on as we continue to appropriately socially distance ourselves. Our goal is to not distance ourselves intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally. And so this is one opportunity that has arisen, a product of this time that we're living through, that I am so grateful to be able to facilitate. I've been talking to artists and educators all over the world. Today, I am thrilled to have a colleague and someone I consider a friend all the way back in Texas, my home state, Dr. Sara Harris Baker. And I'm so happy to have her with us today. I'm excited to talk specifically, as my children are probably burning my house down. I'm going to mute for a second. It's called parenting. This is how you know it's live. I'm excited to have this conversation because I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Baker and talking to her about her program that she's established and the way that they accept students into the music program. And so I'm going to have her introduce herself in a second, give us some context of where she is and what she's doing. But I have had a really unique opportunity to be a part of SPU when we were making sort of similar decisions and transitions, particularly around how people join the program and how they get to study music. And so the big question that I hope to discuss today is why we have auditions for people to study music in college, just broadly speaking. Now, this is not questioning auditions unilaterally, right? Like, why do we have auditions for ensembles, or why do we have auditions for scholarships? Or this is not to discredit the incredible work and dedication that some musicians and artists have and the reward that they can get from competitive like scholarships or placements and ensembles and such. It's not to say that auditions are inherently bad, but when we're talking about education and access to education, I have been wondering for a long time why we restrict that. And this goes all the way back to when I was teaching in high school. We had ability-based groupings, which a lot of people do, but I always saw that as an opportunity to meet the students where they were and challenge them appropriately so that students didn't feel overly challenged and ultimately frustrated, or that they didn't feel under-challenged and ultimately frustrated. But to do those ability-based groupings, we meet students where they are and do those assessments to find out where they create a benchmark and then sort of challenge them and find reward in that educational process. Rather, I had so many colleagues, particularly at the secondary level, starting in 6th grade, that saw ability-based groupings as a way to segregate ensembles, that you had to be good enough to, be in the varsity group, or if you were good enough, I heard that phrase all the time, you would get to participate in certain groups. And I just never really understood it, because if a student is quote unquote good enough, like, why do they even need you in your ensemble? To my own chagrin, I remember saying that in a graduate interview. Needless to say, I didn't get into this program. But I had the graduate faculty, talking to me in my interview, and they asked, questioning some of my skills and some of my talents, and said, well, why don't you know this? Or why don't you know that? And I said, again, I didn't get into this program. I said, well, if I already knew all of this stuff, then why would I need to go to grad school? I don't understand this deficit mentality that we have, particularly in higher ed, that you have to meet a certain bar to be able to be passionate about something and study something. Why does that exist? There are lots of sociocultural, historical reasons as to why it exists, but I think the question that I'm asking today is, why does it still exist? Why are we still perpetuating these tropes that talent is somehow a real tangible thing that certain people have and some people don't have, with the incredible work of Dr. Shinichi Suzuki with research and talent education? I mean, these myths have been debunked. Talent is not a thing. You're not born with talent or not with talent. We know through operant conditioning, we know through human psychology and observable behaviors, we know through music education research that human beings have the ability to challenge themselves and enhance themselves based off of their passions and access to education. So, what is this? What is it that we're doing in higher ed in particular that we're still segregating students based off of perceived abilities and isolated assessments? Why do we still keep doing that? This is obviously a huge question. And as mentioned in our previous teacher talks, the goal is not to find the answer, but the goal is to facilitate dialogue. And again, I am so happy to have with me my colleague, Dr. Baker, to be able to talk about this from the perspective of institutions that are not necessarily restricting people from studying music based off of an audition, and what those opportunities look like, and then hopefully how you could have the same dialogue, whether you're teaching middle school or high school, whether it's an elementary ensemble. Is your after school choir audition based, and why? Is that ukulele ensemble audition based, and why? So asking those questions is the goal today. Sara, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself. So there's no such thing as talking too much with teacher talks. That's why I wanted you here. So tell us as much as you can so that people have context to kind of where you're coming from and what you're doing right now.
Okay. Well, I would say that even though I work in higher ed now, that my heart is as a K-12 choral music educator. That's my background. I have taught junior high in the public schools, high school in the public schools. I went to Southwestern University in Georgetown, did my undergrad there. In fact, that's where I know Erin, your wife, from. And so we've been friends and co-stars in productions for many years. And then I did my master's at Boston University while I was teaching full time. And then after that, I went and did my PhD in music ed at LSU, and then came back to Texas and had this opportunity to work at Temple College in my hometown even. So that's pretty amazing. I am now the director of fine arts at Temple College, which means that I'm over visual arts, speech humanities, drama, dance, and music. I am still part of the music faculty. And also we have a partnership with Texas A&M University, Central Texas, where we offer a bachelor's degree on our campus as well. So I am the program coordinator for the bachelor's program, in addition to being part of the music faculty and an administrator with Temple College. Temple College is an open access institution. It's a 2-year community college. And that means that any student can pursue any career path or any degree path that they choose. They are not limited by having a certain score on a test or anything like that. They're not limited by an audition process to come into our program. So they come with what they have and we meet them where they are. We do have a test called the TSI that is a basic proficiency test in reading, writing, and math. And we do have lots of students that come in not TSI complete. So at that point, they're having to do some remediation in addition to pursuing their degree plan of choice. But one of our missions at Temple College is to just help students achieve their dreams, whatever those dreams might be, and wherever the starting place for that might be. Does that kind of get you started on that?
Yeah, I love it. And I threw in some links to the Temple College music program, particularly for those of you that are in the Central Texas area, but definitely admission is not limited to Texas residents. So anyone that's interested in being in Central Texas or interested about what Dr. Baker's talking about, please make sure that you check it out. I have sent one of my students, although he did not matriculate into the program. I am very excited about.
He's still with us. He's taking some basic classes. So
good.
It hasn't come in as a full music major yet, but we're still watching.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. He ended up getting married and moving and like living his best life. So I'm happy for him. But I offer this link in true support of everything that Temple College has been doing. It's extraordinary what's happening. And I bring up my student because this to me was the epitome of what we sort of starting this conversation with is people that have a passion for whatever it is, in this case, music, and want to be able to study. And I think what frustrated me the most, with this student in particular, but there are so many, at some point in his education, he was told that he wasn't good enough, that college wasn't a reality, that it wasn't something that he should be doing. And it took so much time and energy to convince him otherwise. Um,
Mhm.
as as Sarah knows, just to get him to go to Temple College, I like strapped him into my car and drove him down there just to get him to go, because there was always an excuse, there was always a reason, and so much of it was external, so much of it was cultural. He had so many people supporting him, but at some point he had made up his mind that it wasn't accessible, that he wasn't the kind of person that did those types of things, like these
Mhm.
horrid cliches that keep people from higher ed. And again, there's a very rich sociocultural historical reason that I think that happens, particularly for marginalized communities. But in general, it kind of boggles my mind that in the 21st century we perpetuate this idea that you have to quote unquote be good enough to make music, to study music, to pursue your passions. Um, I'm curious because obviously I have lots of thoughts on this, but I want to go to you. So, Dr. Baker, what have you thought about that? Was this a couple questions? Um, Coming into work at Temple College, was this something you were already conscious of? Was this something that sort of evolved of being at an open access institution and knowing that you would take students and meet them where they were? Was it a reason that you wanted to work at Temple? Was it something you sort of came into? And then how are you positioned with it now, especially creating this collaboration with A&M and sort of seeing people through a bachelor's degree? And do you still see a lot of the gatekeeping, as the phrase is, happening? And what are your reactions to that for students?
Right. Well, I'm one of those people that feels like that having diversity in institutions is a wonderful thing, and that Temple College isn't trying to be Juilliard, and Juilliard isn't trying to be Temple College. So I think there's a need in our society for a Juilliard, and there's a need in our society for a Temple College, and there's a need in our society for a Southwestern University or an LSU or, all of those kinds of schools. It so happens that I find a lot of purpose and fulfillment in our position in higher education, that we are taking students who, for whatever reason, like you were talking about, don't feel like that they have all the tools right now to be at Juilliard or whatever, and that we're able to take them from where they are to where they're going. And that's something that is very personally fulfilling to me, and that meets my personal commitment to equity, to, and attempting to achieve equity, which is a lifelong goal that we keep working on. But I think several things that I kind of thought of that I jotted down while you were talking earlier. So an audition is basically a showcase of your formal training in a certain area or instrument or what have you. So to have the access to formal training is already in and of itself a privilege, right? So, if you had a choir program, for instance, with choir and orchestra too, that not every school even has one. So let's say that I feel like my passion is singing in a choir, but I go to a small rural school that doesn't have a choir, or I go to a school where the choir has been cut for budget reasons because there's only enough money to do either band or choir, and one of them goes to football games and the other one doesn't, So where those things are concerned, I feel like we're showcasing this formal training, but not every student has had access to that formal training. And even for schools that do have choral programs, some of them have private voice lessons that you can take as part of your education that's paid for by the Booster Club, or that is maybe privately funded by the parents, so that you're able to take private lessons and learn solo literature, whereas some other students may only know their choral literature. And you don't come into an audition and just sing the alto part of All I Want for Christmas Is You. It's not very impressive, right? Whenever you do that. So, not having access to those types of formal training certainly is a hindrance in an audition setting. And at Temple College, we have a lot of students come in who have maybe a lot of informal training. We have had two, I was just talking to our percussion instructor about these two awesome gospel drummers that we've had over the last 6 or 7 years. They have ears, they have chops. They don't necessarily know how to read rhythms off the page, and so that then is an issue if we put sight reading music in front of them and say, okay, sight read this, but that's not the way that they have learned music. Then we're taking away from their ability to get an education in that area because they learn music a different way. I remember when I was at Southwestern, we had a visiting Thai professor in our world music class, and we had to learn how to play the Thai instruments. I got the Ranat Ek, and we learned, the first day a little 4, 6, 8 measure piece. And we learned it by ear because that's what he told us we had to do. And I said, okay, well, now do you have the sheet music so I can take it home and work on it? He said, that's not how we do things. You don't write it down, like you remember it. And I was like, oh, I'm never going to remember this, music until next week. And he said, well, that's what we do. So if you want to remember it, you have to get with somebody who knows it and practice it, And so that just the methods of transmission then in and of themselves being gatekeepers, right? So because somebody doesn't transmit music by written music, that, does that mean that they don't have musical ability or that they don't have musical potential or that they can't find a career in a place where their musical talents could be utilized? So I think that's kind of interesting. And then another thing I think is kind of interesting is, we don't do this with other majors necessarily. So if we have a good criminal justice program here at Temple College, so you don't go to, show your criminal justice skills. And if you don't have adequate criminal justice skills, you don't get admitted to the criminal justice program, or you don't go to the nursing program. And if you don't have, adequate nursing skills prior to being taught any of the nursing skills at the college, that we say, oh, you don't seem to have an understanding already of how these nursing skills work. So, it's our job to teach them. And we know in music that that we have this 10,000 hours that we need to achieve proficiency in something, true proficiency in the talent research is that it's really a 10,000 hour proficiency. And so, of course, some colleges, competitive colleges, are going to want to get students who have as many of those 10,000 hours behind them already as possible. But that doesn't mean that they're not capable. It just means they don't already have those hours behind them. So that was a couple of things that I kind of thought about as you were talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting now during the COVID-19 pandemic. I feel as though perhaps I'm being, blissfully optimistic, but I feel as though higher ed was making important turns into conversations of equity and access. Sadly, with the murder of George Floyd, there was an even stronger push, particularly as it becomes to access for marginalized communities, in higher ed and just in general, in the job market and society writ large. And it was exciting for myself to be making that transition. That's why I loved teaching public school, was access and being able to work with every student. And it was difficult for me to come into higher ed. Last year was my first year teaching college, and then we had a global pandemic. And I immediately saw how the sociocultural inequities were magnified because of the pandemic. And exactly what you're saying. In Washington State, the first case was diagnosed in King County, where I live near Seattle. And our state had a very aggressive sort of immediate response, and things were shutting down very quickly. And for bands and choirs in public schools, because of the aerosol studies that were happening, I mean, they were canceling programs. They were literally cutting choirs, cutting bands. Strings and percussion were supposedly allowed to still get together, but there was no in-person instruction. And a lot of the more affluent communities in the state of Washington, we saw students suddenly getting more private lessons, virtual private lessons, or they were getting access still to, as you mentioned, sort of professional musical training outside of the school day, and they weren't quote unquote falling behind. That was the dialogue. It's still been the dialogue in the state of Washington: is, are our students falling behind? Where will this class of graduates be? And it really frustrated me because I thought for years this really positive work, this slow sort of inching forward in terms of equity and access to higher ed, has now just been dropped kicked back 100 yards, because now we're starting to see more affluent communities have access to privileged education. They're studying with members of the Seattle Symphony. They're still taking private lessons. They're still doing these things because they can. Students that literally just didn't have Wi-Fi and internet access because they lived in communities that weren't hardwired for it. The only time they had internet access was when they were at school or at a public library, and that was taken away. I mean, there were kids, I know this happened in Texas too, talking to colleagues. There were kids that weren't in school for months because they just didn't have internet access. It's not that they didn't want to be, but there was no cell phone service, there was no, and it's it's scary. I wish I had some, silver bullet. Hold on, bud. I wish I had some silver bullet, but it's a problem that we're going to be dealing with for years, I think, is a very severe inequity to educational access during the pandemic, and what that means for different communities as they start going in. Shout out to Josh Lau that's watching me. He does want a snack. He wants this little meat stick, but it's almost lunchtime, and you're going to have lunch when mommy comes home from work. So we need to wait for our snack. Good looking out, Josh. But yeah, I mean, it's, I genuinely do not want to be a pessimistic person, and I hide behind calling myself, a realist. But I don't think it's pessimistic. I think that institutions in general, we have to prepare for this. I think we need to open our doors even wider. We need to be much more conscientious of where our students are coming from. And this is way beyond race. I mean, this is literally geography, socioeconomic status, all of these things, because there are certain parts of the country that were affected more than others. And I think we're going to see a reduction of out of state, students. I think we're going to see a surge in community college attendance, which I think is great, and more online courses and curriculum. But I think I'm at a private 4-year liberal arts college. And these have been conversations that, I mean, people are screaming in our faculty meetings of, we need to focus on what's going on, because the access to our institution has become even more prohibited. Students are not coming in the same way. And I'm very grateful to be at an institution that has started addressing those things. Several institutions done this all over. Like, we waived our test scores, so we're not looking at test scores for these incoming freshmen. Like, that's not something that applies to your scholarship requirements. It's none of those things. The music department that I work for, we made this decision last year, actually, before the pandemic had hit, but we got rid of our audition requirement. Students are no longer required to audition to study music at Seattle Pacific University. And we got a lot of confusion and kickback and a lot of people questioning it. Like, no, it's not. I know mommy's home, so you're going to have lunch in a little bit, bud. Don't let him have that little meat stick. I told him he can have lunch, not the little snack. No, he needs to eat his lunch. This is the beauty of a live stream. This is how you know it's real. But anyway, I don't want to be redundant, but I really feel like we should see more, like, really intense action from 4-year state institutions and more. I am not, and again, I'm sort of bitter and jaded that I'm not satisfied with what I'm seeing. And I have twin baby brothers that are 18 years old, graduating from high school this year, applying for college. And I've been really frustrated as they're filling out their application, and they're like, there aren't changes. These institutions are saying, no, we just expect you to come in and we are sympathetic to what you're going through. And I'm like, I don't need you to be sympathetic. I need you to be realistic. The students that are graduating this year, and even those from last year, do not have the same access to education as their peers, and you're holding on to a standard that your institutions create, right? Like our institutions create these standards. There isn't some magical, university wizard or fairy that says like these are the requirements for college. Every institution makes these requirements. And so we're holding on to them and not responding to what's going on in the world. I don't know if you've had students that have had that frustration already, or how close you are to those issues. But obviously, I don't want to project on other institutions. Every institution is unique and has to make its own decisions. But I think it is globally an issue that has to be addressed.
We're kind of in an interesting crunch right now at the two-year colleges. So you're talking about the growth in institutions, which traditionally, when there is an economic crisis of whatever kind, enrollment in two-year community colleges goes up because there's less security about sending students to expensive four-year universities. And also, when people lose their jobs, they're looking to retool their skills or retrain for other things. And so that's one reason that there are some incentives to come to two-year institutions. But at the same time, with the pandemic, we're seeing a lot of students who are feeling responsibility to go work at the grocery store so that they can help their parents meet bills and things like that. So unlike many other times in history where an economic downturn has led to an increase in enrollment, it's kind of a balanced effect of people not feeling like they have the luxury of going to college right now, and people who are needing to retool their skills. We have a large hospital in Temple that has laid off, and it's a hospital system around the state, but they laid off about 3,000 employees earlier in the year, and then they just announced another 1,000 employees layoff. So it is still an economic crisis that we're dealing with, and maybe some of those students will be looking, or some of those potential students will be looking to retool skills and move into some high demand professions and things like that, but that kind of remains to be seen. So what you were talking about the institutions waiving test scores or getting rid of auditions or things like that, I was just 2 weeks ago at the TAMS conference, which is the Texas Association of Music Schools conference, and I was encouraged to hear from some of our large flagship universities in Texas that they are permitting a variety of methods for auditions. So they're allowing a live streamed audition, they're allowing a pre-recorded audition, they're allowing some things that in past years they would never have permitted, but that this year they are trying to be more open about some of those ways in which they will accept auditions. So I hope that does meet the concern that I know that their leadership has about equity, that somebody might not have a stable enough internet connection at home to do a Zoom audition, but they might be able to record something and send it in whatever way that they're able to do that. So I have seen from some of the Texas institutions a desire to be more equitable in that way. And they're still fretting about how to best recruit a freshman class and to reach out to students and maintain diversity in their program.
Have you felt the urge to really change what it is that you're doing as an ensemble director, as an educator? I just had this conversation with a colleague the other day. So we, SPU has been in a hybrid model since the fall. We've been so blessed. I mean, we're a small enough institution. We have just around 3,000 students that are, going to school at SPU. And so we were able to mitigate a lot of the risks. It was not 100%, nothing ever is, but I've been really impressed with the university's response to COVID and how they handle things. And they've limited the number of people that are on campus, the number of people housed on campus. They've increased access to online learning. And so there have been all of these responses, but they wanted to come back hybrid. A lot of institutions especially for your institutions in Washington, have still been online, have basically spent the entire year online, which is intense, as everyone can imagine. So we've been one of the few universities that actually has offered some in-person instruction. And so in doing that, this was since we go back in September. Uh, since September, all of my orchestra rehearsals, I've had a small consort of instruments that are meeting with me in person, socially distanced with PPE, and then I have a Zoom screen up, and I have people that are tuning in from Hawaii and New York and Idaho and West Virginia, and they did not want to travel back to Washington because of, traveling by air and all of these concerns. They also wanted to stay in their state, close to their family. So I've had that. And now we're going on, 6 or 7 months of that. Well, actually, yeah, 6 or 7 months of that hybrid instruction. Last spring, we went fully online. But now we've had this hybrid model. And I was talking to one of my colleagues and I was saying, I'm sort of preparing for this to be a new normal, that I can appreciate why a student, particularly, zooming in from Hawaii, is thinking, I'm going to save money, being able to learn from home. I'm getting access to a lot of the same opportunities. They're not exactly the same, but I am seeing instruction. I'm witnessing it. I'm still a part of this classroom. It has been a steep learning curve, to say absolutely the very least, of learning how to lead, a hybrid rehearsal with people muted on Zoom, and what that looks like. And I'm still learning. I have a lot more that I can do. But for the first time since the pandemic had started, I had actually found a sense of peace about it. And you had already made this statement, I actually really like the diversity of it. I like that it challenges me not to do things the way that I've always done them, not to perpetuate things that I've inherited as a conductor or as an educator. There is now a new community of virtual learners in front of me. And regardless of my comfort with technology, or I think there's a lot of easy things that I can hide behind, the fact that I have needs in front of me, and I try to look at it just like, especially, this coming from a K through 12 background, when a student has a 504 or an IEP, like when they need accommodations, they're protected by law. Like, you have to offer those accommodations. And I like to imagine that the same sort of moral and ethical standards follow us into higher ed, that if you have a student with needs, whether or not they're registered with the Office of Disabilities, whether or not they're able to advocate for themselves, when you can recognize those needs, I think we should be responding. There's not one way of learning, therefore there's not one way of teaching. And so here are these students that have these concerns and needs. They're on a screen in front of me. I need to respond to that. And I really do. I mean, I said it this way to my colleague. I said, I wouldn't, there's been a lot that has surprised me this year. A lot. And I don't think I would be surprised if this became a normal, that we will have some students that just fully participate in our program online, and how are we going to respond to that? Have you had similar conversations or ideas, or what's been your experience through all this?
Right. So Temple College was entirely online starting in March at spring break. We had one extra week after spring break and then came in fully online. And then we have been primarily...
Because that's all you need. You just need a week to transition your entire curriculum to be online. Right. I mean...
And we've been primarily online for the last year, with very few exceptions, like science labs, maybe musical sectionals and very small groups. But primarily, I appreciate the fact that our administration and our board, which is made up of a lot of health professionals, has taken a really conservative approach to how we're going to handle in-person classes, because we do have not only the health of the students to consider, which is of course paramount, but also the health of the faculty. And, so there are a lot of concerns there. And I'm grateful that we've been given some flexibility where that's concerned, to not have to jump back into classes full of students necessarily. But what you're talking about having a live rehearsal and having a Zoom rehearsal, that's why teachers are tired right now, is because we're trying to teach, 2 or more methodologies at the same time. Now, one thing that I do think the pandemic has done is it has forced us light years forward in our use of technology for music education. I'm a little bit of a Luddite myself. Like, I'm so glad you sent me the link, because if I had to find it, figure out how to start one of these, I could never have done that. But, so I feel like that there has been a forced embrace of technology for music education, whereas we have been one of the late adopters of this kind of education. And so that in the end may be something that we look back at as a benefit of the pandemic, is that we learned how to use technology more efficiently for the purpose of music education. But at the same time, I feel like trying to be everything to everybody is exhausting, and is, we're putting a great deal of pressure on teachers and professors to try to accommodate multiple methodologies at the same time, hybrid and in person and online. And, we're trying to be everything to everybody. And it wasn't done with any kind of intentionality. It was just like, okay, do it now. And so, now we're having to 9 months in kind of reflect at what's working and what's not working, and make, micro adjustments to the curriculum kind of as we go, to try to meet student needs. But of course, I do definitely feel a moral and ethical obligation to every single one of my students that they get what they need. And that doesn't just mean in the classroom. To me, that's a whole student thing. Here at Temple College, we have it's called the Circle of Support, staffed by a social worker, where we pursue the non-academic obstacles for our students. So like yesterday, we just had the Central Texas Food Bank come and do a food distribution. In the morning, we have resources for textbooks for students who need to borrow or buy textbooks that they can't afford. We have the connection to mental health services, housing services, all of those kinds of things that are maybe obstacles to our students learning outside of just their academic needs. So, of course, with the pandemic, we have seen an uptick in non-academic student needs as well. So we're definitely trying to meet their needs in a whole array of ways. And that task can be overwhelming as well. Thinking about how many hurdles that we have to get over with the students in order for them to be successful. Because even though Temple College is an open access institution, we still have degree requirements. We still have standards at the conclusion of a degree. Those things have not changed. We still are obligated to our transfer partners to graduate students who are prepared for that university curriculum. And so, we're still having to meet all of those needs in addition to the academic needs.
I'm glad you brought up the S word, as I like to call it, standards. It's interesting because in this broader conversation of, why do we require auditions and what's going on, this gatekeeping that's taking place in higher ed that is not just music related, but we're specifically talking about music. I don't know why the immediate assumption is that we have to sacrifice standards by welcoming people into our institution to study. Like, I don't, again, there is a rich sociocultural, historical justification, if I could use that word, for why those ideas exist. But in the 21st century, I have hoped that we've matured past that to know that you don't sacrifice standards just by welcoming more people in. The standards should be tied to real, practical, sort of pragmatic applications of the student's knowledge. So and this was something that SPU battled with when we made this decision that we weren't going to have students auditioning to start the program. We would meet everybody where they are. It forced us to be much more intentional about student engagement, because now it wasn't a matter of, you want to come in and you want a bachelor's degree in violin performance, right? Well, we have a degree outline, we have degree requirements. You've got to come in at this level and you're going to spit out the other side of the machine having earned this degree and having met these requirements. Now it forced us, instead of just, we're going to feed you into the sausage maker and you're going to come out the other end, it was suddenly, okay, let's find out where you are. Like, this audition is going to give me a benchmark that's going to let me know what you believe your talents are, but I need to invest in you, find out more about what's going on and what your background is, and then build a unique plan that serves you to get you from point A to point B. But we really can't keep our eyes on point B being the standards, the degree requirements. We're actually looking at point C. We're looking at your life after college, after the degree, and what does that look like? And although, yes, we have certain institutional standards and we have degree requirements, those have sort of a finite goal in mind, that you earn a degree. But that doesn't actually yield sort of product in your life, revenue in your life, right? That's not, and I think for myself, even, I've been a student for a long time, and I think that's always been a misconception that I held, that, like, I get the degree and therefore I've achieved this thing. Well, of course you've achieved something, but that's not the end goal. And it's the same thing when I was teaching high school. I'd always ask the students, like, what do you want to do after you graduate? And so many of them had been trained to see this graduation is the end goal. Like, that's what I need to get. I was like, but then the next morning you wake up and what's happening? And how can I prepare you to be successful in that moment? And I wouldn't be so bold to say that that's not happening at institutions, but I think in general in higher ed, I mean, this is worldwide, I think that we become so focused on standards, which are tied to institutional expectations to generate, degrees, that becomes an end goal. And we see it in the reporting of institutions. We talk about retention rates and graduation rates, and we loosely talk about job placement and alumni relations, right? It's always sort of on the fringe of reporting, but when you see the best colleges in these different rankings, they're always talking about retention and graduation rates. And it's good. I mean, you can consider that effectiveness, but there's life after college, and it scares me that I would argue, especially in this time that we're living through, I know a lot more people right now that have degrees in music and are not able to support themselves than I do people that were at institutions that challenged them to think divergently and look past the degree as the epitome of their education, and have started nonprofits and created virtual music studios and, like, been able to adapt to life's challenges. And it's so interesting. You brought up Juilliard, and it's not just Juilliard, but I think the more exclusive the institution is, the more that becomes a challenge, because then it becomes, well, if I just have this degree from this institution, I have made it and the doors will open. And in some cases in the arts, that can be true, but I think we have to be a little more conscientious of what doors are opening, because those doors usually close even quicker in times of social and political and economic unrest. And and again, I'm this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. This is not necessarily based on fact and more based off of my own experiences, but it's interesting that, again, hiding behind sort of realism and pragmatism, I want to have those difficult conversations with students. I want to talk to them and say, like, hey, here's what I did after I graduated. And I was a gigging musician, and I was contracted with, 5 different civic symphonies, because I wasn't going to get hired by a major symphony. I didn't have time to prepare auditions. I was also working side gigs and doing other jobs, but I could get into civic symphonies, and I didn't have to have contracted positions. And it required me to travel every weekend. And I have, like, this was the life that I led, and I paid my rent, and I was happy, and I was performing, and I was using my skills and my talents. And I feel like instead of that, we still perpetuate the tropes of, like, you're going to go in and land the symphony job, and that's the only thing you have to do. And I'm especially talking from a string perspective. And I'm like, that life doesn't necessarily exist anymore. And at least it's not. I had a friend of mine equate it to this, and I thought it was so appropriate. It's the NFL dreams, It's you meeting that middle schooler that says, well, I want to be a pro ball player. It's like, that's great. Have that passion, make that dedication. But statistically speaking, there is such a small number of people that actually make it to that? And what are the other things that you're going to do with your life? Not a backup plan, because I hate that term, because that's how a lot of people see music ed. It's not a backup plan. What else can you do with these talents and skills you're developing? And I need more string players in particular, but just more music students to recognize that. Like, it's great. Have the goal. Dream big. Don't tell yourself that you can't. But in the pursuit of that, do not set yourself up to only be after degree, to only be after that spot in the orchestra, to only be, there has to be greater depth to what it is that you're using your skills for. Because then there's a global pandemic, because then the world turns upside down and that is no
Right.
longer an opportunity.
Sure. I think Erin, your wife, and I belong to one of the same forums for classical singers. And in that forum, right now there's a lot of talk about the side hustle, right? The side hustle has become the main hustle because they're not able to work professionally as singers right now. We have a graduate who has a jazz piano degree, and he was playing on cruise ships. Well, guess what? There are no cruise ships right now, to go play on. So that career, which was a lucrative and fun career, has kind of dried up, at least on the short term. So a couple things that kind of struck me as you were talking just now. One is that we need to train our students in entrepreneurship. Any school, any music school that isn't offering either a supplemental curriculum in entrepreneurship or a curricular program in entrepreneurship needs to really get serious about that. I just put in a syllabus at A&M Central Texas for an entrepreneurship class that we'll start offering next year. But we definitely need to kind of look at, that's what you're talking about as far as, okay, so how do I go about building my brand as a musician? How do I go about, filling my days with work that's meaningful to me and that pays the bills? And, kind of looking at the various niche opportunities that are out there to meet your purpose and your talents and what they will pay you to do, and create that opportunity for yourself. And this book was actually within hand reach of me right now, but this is You Majored in What? And it actually talks about several things that you can do with a degree in fine arts, and how a lot of people with degrees in the liberal arts and the fine arts are finding success everywhere, not just in their field of study. I know at A&M Central Texas last year, we put out a report by major of student income, and I was pretty surprised to see that the liberal arts, the liberal studies majors had the highest income of any of the graduates that were coming out of A&M Central Texas. And that includes the business majors and the careers that you might think would make more money, but it was actually the liberal studies students that were making the most money. They have the ability to move into those kinds of jobs that don't exist when you start school. And I've talked to my child extensively. So I have a 14-year-old who feels like they have to come up with their whole career plan like right now. And I'm like, look, a lot of the jobs that'll be available by the time you graduate from college don't exist right now. Why say you have to put yourself on this track for this one job that may or may not be a job in 8 years, or might be outsourced somewhere else in 8 years? Let's build those critical thinking skills and those communication skills and those kinds of skills that allow you to be successful in any field, and the soft skills as well that allow you to be successful in any field.
I remember hearing our guidance counselors at the high school I was working at say that all the time, and it unfortunately became sort of this tired cliche especially amongst high school seniors, sort of rolling their eyes with you're training for the jobs of tomorrow. The job you'll have doesn't even exist yet. And I hope that people have really woken up to that through the pandemic of literally you will be creating a job that doesn't exist. And it's so important in the arts. And now, as you already mentioned, we've gotten this huge shove for technology integration, particularly in music ed. But I think beyond that, just how we engage in the arts, how we consume the arts. There's now been this huge influx for producers and sort of media and tech, and like that's a big push right now within the arts in general. All of these, Seattle Symphony, Seattle Opera, like all of our local arts organizations are now creating jobs. And they're saying now we need to expand our department that's like media and tech and production, and like now we're doing seasons that are completely online. And it's exciting to me because
Churches.
yeah, they need people with the musical background. They
Mhm.
because they are music organizations or they are theater organizations. So they're not just hiring someone that can work a camera. They're hiring someone that can work a camera that has an artistic perspective. And so you are starting to blend these different fields, and I mean, without diminishing the significance of how this has negatively impacted the world, I try to find moments of hope in situations like this, where it's like there are now opportunities that never existed, and people that felt like they no longer had an avenue into the arts because they weren't a good enough performer, but they always loved being behind the scenes or whatever. Like this is their time. Like now people are calling on them like, I know you know how to work the soundboard or work the camera or help us do editing. Can we call on you to do this? And I love that. I love to see people finding that success.
Right. And this has created, the pandemic created a shift in the workforce. So overnight, all of a sudden, we don't need those anymore. We need these now, and so students who have the ability to do a variety of things are definitely benefiting from that. And the liberal arts is one place where you learn how to do a variety of things and how to do deep dives into things that interest you and have
Yeah.
that intellectual curiosity, develop that intellectual curiosity. It's like, well, I don't know how to do that, but this is how I would go about learning how to do that. And, kind of either learning how to get to a formal pathway of learning something new or an informal pathway of learning something new that then allows you to be successful in your next job.
Yeah, I love it. I'm curious. I don't want to. I mean, this is a huge question, and we can sort of wrestle with this. But I want to be conscious of the time and respect your time. We have a few minutes left. I'm curious if you have uh, sort of any words of wisdom or advice for students that are sort of in college right now and navigating this virtual world, and then students that are thinking about coming into college and study music. Undoubtedly, you're talking to prospective students. Sort of now is that season. Kids are making decisions and getting ready for graduation. We just had a big sort of recruitment event yesterday, and I have found myself when I'm talking to students, and it's interesting. And to my own, God bless my department chair. I know that I've given him a few gray hairs because one of the things and I think when we got to spend some time together, I think you saw this as well. I've never been completely married to any institution. That like if I see that something's not going to work for a student, I want to tell them this is not going to work. Like for whatever reason, like this isn't going to work. Don't waste the time. Don't waste the money. Don't waste the energy. Um, and I say, and I love my department chair, but I'm sure I have frustrated him because he's been with me at recruitment events where I'll start talking about other schools with kids. Like I'll find out in the conversation that they're really passionate about something, and I'm like, oh, but do you know this person at this university? They love that exact same thing, and you should talk to them. And of course, here's my department chair looking at me like, what are you doing? Don't send kids to other schools. I'm like, but that's the thing. I don't need to trick a kid into coming to school with me because ultimately it's going to affect retention. And if especially if I'm conscious that it's going to negatively affect the student, I need to be aware of that. I can never sacrifice the needs of my students for institutional needs. Like I just can't. And I know so many other educators that feel the same way, that you have to find that balance. And so even in talking to kids this past week, I've been visiting with some high school seniors, and really surprised one of them in particular because I'm thinking about it right now. We had a conversation yesterday. Her grandfather is an emeriti faculty of SPU. And so her grandfather has since she was born, been pushing her like, you're going to be a Falcon, right? And so sure enough, I had come in, my predecessor had retired, and Here it is, his granddaughter's senior year in high school, and someone immediately tagged me. Like he reaches out to our program coordinator who called me and like, here's this Emeriti faculty. We love him. He's a huge part of our history at the institution, and he wants to connect with you. He wants to feel you out because he wants his granddaughter to be here. And so I meet with him. We have this awesome conversation, like 2-hour conversation just about music education and what's happening in the world. And he's like, well, I feel good about this, and I want you to talk to my granddaughter because I want her to come to SPU. So we set up this Zoom session, and we're in the Zoom session and we're talking about SPU. And then I go, well, what other institutions are you applying to? And her father and her grandfather just look at me. She's like, oh, I'm thinking about these other places. I was like, oh my gosh, that's awesome. I know the person that's over here. And, I'm still getting used to Washington, but you need to talk to this person and tell them I said hello. And, they have this really great thing. And they're just looking at me like I'm insane. And I'm going, look, I want to work with someone that wants to work with me. I don't want to work with someone that's, again, kind of backtracking, that's interested in a degree from my institution. And that's why they're coming here, is they just want to say they graduated from this place. It's not the person that I'm interested in working with. Now, if they end up here, I'm going to work with them, obviously. But if you're giving me the opportunity to have a conversation before you make a decision, you have the power in the agency. And this goes back to the very beginning of this conversation. I feel like too many students are told that they have to be desperate to get into college rather than the colleges being desperate to work with them. And colleges and universities don't exist without students, period. And I remember applying to college and thinking how fortunate I was that someone said yes to me. And that is such a horrible mentality to have as a learner, that I'm lucky enough to be able to learn. I've never understood that. And so it's something I constantly am telling high school seniors. And for any teachers that watch this that have seniors, or people that are affiliated with institutions that have high school seniors, let those kids know they have the power. They have a choice, and they need to make a choice that's going to benefit them. And even when they make that choice, they still have the choice. You have to re-register for every semester, for every quarter. And at any time you can say, I'm leaving, because you're paying for that, even if you have financial aid. I've never been able to fully appreciate the idea that there are institutions that will tell students they're lucky to be there. I can't get behind that. And so, forgive me, I know that's super long-winded, but I'm curious in the context of that, because I know we share a lot of similar philosophies. What would you say to those kids? What are you telling kids right now?
Well, here's what I would tell a high school student is find an institution that's a match for what you want. And it goes back to what we said at the very beginning about, I think Juilliard has its place. I think UNT has its place. I think Seattle Pacific has its place. I think Temple College has its place. And that we have to find the students. And that is sometimes the trick. And with the pandemic, it's even trickier trick, to go find those students that are the best match for our institution. For instance, I know at Temple College, we have an amazing performing faculty that are very attentive, personally attentive to student needs, and that you can get a degree at Temple College in A&M Central Texas for $19,000 for a 4-year degree, and that we're a family environment that it accepts everybody regardless of where they are today. And that we see a future for a student where they're achieving their passions and their hopes, regardless of whether they come in, a Pavarotti or not. We're ready to take them where they are. And so if that's what a student needs and wants, we're the right place for them. If what a student needs and wants is, to sing with the Metropolitan Opera right after graduation, we may not be the best place for that right now. And so find your match of an institution, and remember that the institution has values too. That it's not just institutional programs, but it's institutional values, and try to find out what are the values that institution has, and do those align with your personal values as well. Because going to an institution that has a great music program or a great visual arts program or a great program, but the institution itself doesn't align with your personal values, is going to create a lot of angst for you. You're going to feel not seen and not valued that institution, even if you're bringing a lot to the table as far as your talent and preparation for that program.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I want to respect your time. I can't. The hour goes by so fast. Um, Dr. Baker, I'm so grateful to have you with us today and to hear about this perspective. Again, I threw into the chat not only a link to Temple College and their music program, but also a link to You Majored in What, this book that you referenced, which I think is awesome. So
yeah, check that out if you have it in your spare time, Chris. Okay.
Oh, yeah, right. I'll put that in my reading list. But for everyone that was able to tune in today, whether you were watching live or if you're able to see this in our archived playlist on YouTube, thank you for listening. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. Now go and talk to other people about it. Please know that this conversation is not limited to the two people that are on the screen. My goal is always to get other people talking about these concepts and issues. These are not the answers. They are just a part of a larger dialogue about what music and education looks like and how the arts can transform our lives. So again, a very special thank you to Dr. Baker. If you'll stay on, I want to give you a personal goodbye. But for everybody else, thank you for watching this. Please feel free to share the link and like and subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you'll get updates. We have more teacher talks coming up. I've committed to 52 weeks. I made a decision I was going to do this for a full year, and we're almost there. There's only about 5 more episodes left, which is crazy to me. So I'm excited to sort of reach the end of this project, and we'll probably do something similar, but I hope you guys will come back and join us for more teacher talks. We'll see you next week.